BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
The Earth Transformed by Peter Frankopan and read by Hugh Bonneville. Episode 1. The World from the Dawn of Time. We should all be grateful for dramatic changes to global climate. Were it not for billions of years of intense celestial and solar activity, repeated asteroid strikes, epic volcanic eruptions, extraordinary atmospheric change, spectacular tectonic shifts, and constant biotic adaptation, we would not be alive today. Conditions have changed constantly, and sometimes catastrophically, since the creation of our planet around 4.6 billion years ago. In today's world, we think of humans as architects of dangerous environmental and climate change, but we are prime beneficiaries of such transformations in the past. The first hominins appeared only a few million years ago, and the first anatomically modern humans, including Neanderthals, around 500,000 years ago. In the grand scheme of history, we are new and very late arrivals. Like rude guests who arrive at the last minute, cause havoc, and set about destroying the house to which they've been invited, human impact on the natural environment has been substantial, and is accelerating to the point that many scientists question the long-term viability of human life. However, our species is not alone in transforming the world around us. Other species of biota, flora, fauna, and microorganisms are not simple bystanders to a relationship primarily between humans and nature. This is one reason why some scholars have criticized the idea and the name of the geological epoch, the Anthropocene, which prioritizes humans into a distinguished species that has claimed the right to identify what is and is not wild, to classify resources as ones that can be used, sustainably or otherwise. For around half the Earth's existence, there was little or no oxygen in the atmosphere. Our planet was formed through a long period of accretion, or gradual accumulation of layers, followed by a major collision with a Mars-sized impactor, which released enough energy to melt the Earth's mantle and create the earliest atmosphere from the resultant exchange between a magma ocean and vapour that was anoxic, that is to say, lacking in oxygen. Around 3 billion years ago, atmospheric oxygen levels accumulated rapidly, resulting in an episode known as the Great Oxidation Event, a key moment that paved the way for the emergence of complex life. The Moon may have played a part in the changes in the millions of years that followed. Formed from debris thrown into space at the time of the impact that created the Earth, the Moon has a gravitational pull that plays a major role in ocean tides. It is responsible for the flows that help transport heat away from the equator and towards the poles, fundamentally shaping Earth's climate. The Moon used to be much closer to the Earth, and roughly 444 million years ago, these forces had a greater impact on the Earth's climate and also perhaps on its wildlife. Recent modelling suggests that big tidal ranges may have been responsible for forcing bony fish into shallow pools on land, thereby prompting the evolution of weight-bearing limbs and air-breathing organs. It still exerts an important influence. The reproductive cycles of many marine creatures are closely synchronized with lunar phases, with migration and spawning in fish, crab, and plankton species triggered by the Moon's glow. The Great Dying was an extinction event which took place 252 million years ago. The primary cause was an epic volcanic episode in what is now Siberia that produced enormous volumes of magma and a series of gigantic, violent eruptions. Colossal amounts of greenhouse gases were injected into the atmosphere, and the ultimate result was the extinction of 96% of marine life, 3/4 of land animals, and all the Earth's forests. The single most famous moment of large-scale transformation in the past, however, was caused by an asteroid strike that impacted the Earth 66 million years ago on the Yucatan Peninsula, near what is now the town of Chicxulub in Mexico, and led to the demise of the dinosaurs. While local devastation of the strike near Chicxulub must have been dramatic, including hurricane-force winds and landslides that scoured the ocean floor, the consequences of this particular strike were global. Around 325 gigatons of sulfur and 425 gigatons of CO2 were forced into the atmosphere at speeds of more than 1 kilometre per second. The result would have included firestorms, short-term cooling from the dust, blocking the sun's light, long-term warming from the release of enormous volumes of CO2, and high levels of ocean acidification. What made this strike so deadly was the size of the impactor, likely part of a comet that was around 12 kilometres in diameter, but also how and where it hit the Earth. Such events were spectacular and devastating. They also played a part in the series of flukes, coincidences, long shots and serendipities that brought about the rise of humankind, as well as the many species of flora and fauna that exist today. All life on Earth today descends from animals, plants and organisms that survived multiple mass extinction events, as well as a near inexhaustible series of smaller-scale episodes of major changes in climatic and atmospheric conditions. Pollen grain analysis from South America shows that the Chicxulub strike helped create tropical rainforests. Before the impact, tropical forest trees were spaced far apart, allowing light to reach the forest floor. After it, perhaps as a result of the extinction of large herbivores, they grew more densely, with greater shade enabling the flourishing of legumes and pods. Ashfall from the impact added minerals to terrestrial ecosystems, which in turn were crucial in stimulating soil fertility and forest productivity. This enhanced the relative advantage for flowering plants over conifers and ferns, creating a springboard for a surge in biodiversity and the conditions for the enormous rainforests that are such an important part of the carbon cycle today. Geology and movement of tectonic plates also played a significant role in shaping and reshaping the Earth, and in creating the geographic distribution of water, land, and life as we know it. Over the course of millions of years, a single giant supercontinent broke up. In some cases, surges of hot material from a supervolcano caused plates to split and rotate. Ultimately, these movements led to the distribution of the world's continents into the positions they occupy today. However, not all land masses remained above sea level. For instance, a piece of continental plate around the size of Greenland broke off from what later became North Africa, crashed into southern Europe, and was forced underneath it. Impacts like this resulted in enormous forces being created, and in land becoming crumpled, creating the great mountain ranges of the world. The Himalayas were formed when the Indian subcontinent smashed into Eurasia around 50 million years ago, pushing land that had been at sea level upwards, with the result that marine fossils can be found at or near the summits of some of the highest peaks on Earth. The formation of these mountain ranges has in turn played a part in changing local, regional and even global climate patterns. The location and size of the Rockies affects precipitation patterns on the east coast of North America, in the North Atlantic and perhaps as far away as Norway. From the perspective of the 21st century, however, what was even more significant was the fact that the continental rifts, collisions and changes to major ocean basins resulted in the creation of massive hydrocarbon deposits. Almost all the world's giant oil and gas fields cluster in just 27 key regions around the world. The location of these fields underpins a fossil fuel economy worth trillions of dollars a year, but it is also the main driver of climate change in the modern era. The energy revolution that began with the burning of fossil fuels accelerated rapidly with the development of motors, engines and power stations that are fired by oil and gas. It also helped open up new ecological frontiers too. The rise of cities across the Midwest in the United States and beyond was facilitated by vast deposits of coal, oil and gas in Illinois, Nebraska, and further south in a giant belt from the Dakotas down into New Mexico. This helped to create a manufacturing powerhouse, but it also led to population redistribution from the coast to the interior. The story of oil and gas is one that has played a central role in global geopolitics for the last century. Massive reserves in Saudi Arabia, Iran, the Gulf, and elsewhere in the Middle East and North Africa are closely linked to the story of military intervention and to the imposition of autocratic and theocratic regimes. Had there been no oil and gas in the Middle East, things would have been very different. Similarly, the distribution of other resources has played a fundamental role in human history. The world's accessible reserves of precious metals, including gold, are the result of the Earth being bombarded by a flux of meteorites after its formation. Some predict that the 21st century will be shaped by a scramble for a new set of elements, like beryllium, dysprosium and yttrium, which had little use a few decades ago, but are now essential components in many high-tech devices. The environmental lottery applies to a host of other materials and substances too. The importance of spices from South and Southeast Asia, for instance, helped stimulate trading networks that brought these regions into intensive contact with the Middle East, Africa, and the Mediterranean, as well as with China, Japan, and beyond. The habitat of the silkworm was instrumental in the manufacture of textiles that were light, tough, and expensive, and prompted high demand from thousands of kilometers away. The spread of animals and plants as a result of trade is a central part of the world's ecological history, and one in which humans have played a disproportionately significant role. Ecosystems have always been transformed and reshaped by many non-human forces. What humans do, on the other hand, is to bring about change through conscious modification of landscapes, deliberate intervention into ecosystems, and intentional, ill-conceived decisions that lead to over-exploitation. In that sense, the evolution of our species has been the single most important development in the history of this planet. Some would argue that the unsustainable way that we live in the 21st century and the impact of global warming is putting the existence of humanity at risk. However, we have also developed capabilities to ensure our own destruction by other means. Accidents like the failure of the reactor at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, the Exxon Valdez oil spill, and the leak at the Union Carbide plant in Bhopal, India, provide warnings that our new technologies can lead to large-scale environmental disasters. Risk levels of human-induced disaster are greater than at any point in history since the emergence of our species. How is it that humans have become so central to the present and future of a planet where we have only been present for what amounts to the batting of an eyelid in the billions of years of history since the Earth was formed?
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
The Earth Transformed by Peter Frankopan, read by Hugh Bonneville. Episode 2, Regarding Nature and the Divine. The dangers of environmental degradation, overconsumption of resources, and unsustainable population load were not lost on people living thousands of years ago. In the Epic of Atrahasis, an old Babylonian text which dates to around 1700 BCE, the gods had created humans, says the narrator, because they realized that they had too much work to do themselves. The trouble was that the gods had not accounted for the length of a natural lifespan, so it was not long before the number of people became too numerous and the country was as noisy as a bellowing bull. As a result, the gods sent terrible droughts that brought famine as well as other solutions to the problem of the excessive number of people, including disease and pestilence. There is considerable evidence in the sources of the awareness of the dangers posed by overexploitation of nature. The writer of the Epic of Gilgamesh counsels that drought followed deforestation. Perhaps most striking is the moment when Gilgamesh kills Humbaba, the forest god, whose murder stands as a metaphor for the deforestation of Mesopotamia and humans' encroachment on the natural world. The rise of the Neo-Assyrian Empire in the centuries that followed the collapse of the Bronze Age brought about profound changes to the environmental, socio-economic and political landscapes of northern Mesopotamia. Urban centres began to grow to astonishing sizes. This required different thinking about the land. One change was the introduction of massive investments in irrigation systems that transformed the landscape. Webs of canals were built that transported snowmelt from the mountains and rivers to the major cities and the fields that surrounded them. These interventions were an important part of an ideological transformation of the landscape that emphasized the power of the Assyrian kings. The illusion of royal power and control over nature extended into other areas too, notably in the form of the king hunting wild and dangerous beasts, which represented his mastery over the animal kingdom and the metaphorical protection he gave in defending his people from threats. Reliefs that show the great king Ashurbanipal wrestling with a lion with his bare hands were intended to show the ruler's superhuman bravery and skill, affirming his authority. Societies differed in their allegiances to individual gods, in the specifics of how to win their favour, how to interpret advice and admonitions. But the approaches were very similar when trying to make sense of the world, particularly in relation to climate and its vagaries. Cosmology was one of these. In Shang dynasty China, the power of elites was closely connected to the ability to control and explain reality and to commune with a complex pantheon of gods that included Di, the high god, and powers like the river, mountain, and sun, as well as mythical and semi-mythical beings and ancestors. Oracle bones, made mainly from ox scapulae and turtle shells, were used as divination tools, with the king or his diviners applying a hot rod to produce a series of heat cracks, and then interpreting the answers accordingly. Auspicious, reads one example, we will receive harvest. The relationship with the supernatural world was administered by the Shang ruler, who had a shamanistic role in undertaking rituals and ceremonies, and acting as an intermediary with the deities as well as with royal ancestors. This required suitable gifts to be given up in offerings to ensure rain and good harvests, and to appease hostile or malevolent spirits. The offerings could be substantial, as is clear from a set of oracle bones that record 100 cups of wine, 100 Chiang prisoners, 300 cattle, 300 sheep, and 300 pigs being given up by one ruler on a single occasion. Human sacrifice of prisoners, usually in groups of 10, but sometimes numbering hundreds, was an important part of creating a dynamic that underlined the king's unique political, social, cultural, and spiritual position. Assuming responsibility for good outcomes in the natural world served as a powerful claim to be the conduit between heaven and earth. For example, one pharaoh in Egypt boasted, "I brought the Nile to the upland in your fields, so that plots were watered that had never known water before." The fusion of benign climate, divine favour, and reward for good leadership was one with deep roots in many parts of the world. The elision of the natural order and power would become a fundamental part of Chinese political and religious philosophy, and of imperial political ideology in particular, over the course of 3 millennia. The period from the 6th century BCE onwards became known as the time of the 100 Schools of Thought. Among figures prominent in this period was Confucius, who counselled that people should aspire to live moral lives. Just as a society as a whole should reflect the celestial order, so too should rulers protect it, while all should live in a way that defended stability and harmony. Such discussions were not entirely dissimilar in India, where the earliest hymns of the Vedic Aryans articulated notions of heaven and earth and of ritu, a settled order, and explained how the universal laws that governed ritu were sustained by the guardian deity Varuna. Early Indian literature took the form of shruti, sayings that were later written down and could be understood only by a rishi, a sage or a wise man. Advice in the Vedas was practical, existential, and spiritual, and included prayers to keep serpents away, alongside guidance on how to use plants to overcome disease, and how to ward off curses, avoid bad dreams, remove the threat of hunger and thirst, and stop losing at dice. In South Asia, Brahmins, holy men or priests, controlled rituals, techniques, and knowledge that enabled intercessions with and even control over the supernatural, including control over favourable climatic conditions. Some would ask which god should be honoured and thanked for creating all humans and animals, for the snow-covered mountains and shining deep waters of the sea. That such views were written down, survived, and were disseminated attests to their significance as the basis of what became Hinduism. Challenges emerged to set out rival cosmologies. The Jain religion advocated a stark rethinking of the world and argued that all organisms, including plants, were alive, as were the elements themselves. Jain ecological cosmology presented human beings as participants in a rich panoply of living entities that included earth and water, fire and wind, grass, trees, and plants, and all creatures that move. And in hurting any of these, states one text, men hurt themselves. It was essential, according to Jain teaching, to understand that a man who lights a fire kills living things. For insects could hop into a fire inadvertently. Worms living in wood that was used as fuel could be burned, and cutting down plants not only killed them, but disrupted habitats for other plants and animals. Among the most prominent challenges were the teachings of the Buddha, the son of a nobleman who spurned a life of luxury to search for enlightenment. Many of the teachings were practical rather than theological. A husband should treat his wife by honouring her. A master should not overwork his servants, should share especially tasty luxuries with them. Being charitable, kind, and reserved was the source of personal treasure, furthermore, that could not be stolen or given to others. Buddhist texts also disdained the slaughter of animals. Indeed, animal sacrifices are said to have produced negative outcomes, including longing, hunger, and decrepitude. This was a provocative and revolutionary approach that effectively called into question the rights of the Vedic priesthood to control ritual and access to the divine. Most scholars agree that the earliest expression of reincarnation comes in one of the early Upanishads. When people depart from this world, it says, it is to the moon that they all go, since the moon is the door to the heavenly world. Those who are unable to pass through to the other side are turned into rain, which then falls on the earth, and they are born again in these various conditions, as a worm, an insect, a fish, a bird, a lion, a boar, a rhinoceros, a tiger, a man, or some other creature. Similar hypotheses were being posited in the Eastern Mediterranean around the same time. Herodotus, writing in the 5th century BCE, observed that Egyptians and then Greeks had adopted the belief that the soul of a human being is immortal, and that each time the body dies, the soul enters another creature, just as it is being born. Among the cosmological views adopted in ancient Greece were the beliefs that the universe was animate, sentient, and intelligent, held together by harmonious forces. This inevitably informed ideas about all living things, which, according to Plato, were all endowed with soul and reason. Those with ascetic beliefs took this further, arguing that eating animals and plants was wrong, as this usually involved killing them. It would be wrong to think that such attitudes were mainstream. For Aristotle, plants existed for the benefit of animals, animals existed for the sake of people, and inferior people served as slaves to those who were superior. Socrates was even blunter, at least according to Plato. There was nothing to be learned from trees, nature, and the countryside. The only place one could gain knowledge was in the city, from other men. Nevertheless, anxieties about environmental degradation and pollution had their champions. As early as 700 BCE, Hesiod was warning about the dangers of urinating or defecating in springs or rivers, stressing that doing so could lead to disease and suffering. Xenophon was one of many who advocated the benefits of good treatment of ecological habitats. There was a growing awareness that resources were finite, and that overexploitation could lead to depletion and exhaustion that not even the gods could resolve, let alone their intercessors on earth. In 243 BCE, edicts set up across Emperor Ashoka's territories in northern India announced that no living beings are to be slaughtered or offered in sacrifice. To support compassionate behavior, the emperor declared that he had made provision for two types of medical treatment for humans and medical treatment for animals. This remarkable investment in welfare was furthered by the announcement that the royal household would become vegetarian. "Formerly in the kitchen," stated Ashoka, "hundreds of thousands of animals were killed every day to make curry. From now on, however, only 3 creatures, 2 peacocks and a deer, are to be killed, and the deer not always." As Xenophon wrote in the Economikos, "The earth willingly teaches righteousness to those who can learn, for the better she is treated, the more good things she gives in return." He did not need to say that those who extracted too much and overexploited resources did not just damage the earth, they demonstrated their failings as humans too.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
The Earth Transformed by Peter Frankopan and read by Hugh Bonneville. Episode 3. The Golden Age of Empire. The first 25 years of the 7th century were a period of extraordinary political instability across Europe, Africa, and much of Asia. The Roman and Persian empires engaged in a phase of almost continuous warfare that saw many of the greatest cities across the Middle East and North Africa change hands. The swings in fortune were not just rapid, but momentous. In 626, the Persian army was massed by the walls of Constantinople, with many citizens cowering inside the great city, fearing the worst. Just a few months later, after mounting one of the most spectacular rearguard actions in history, the Emperor Heraclius had advanced eastwards at lightning speed and crushed a large Persian force at Nineveh, in what is now Iraq. Within a few weeks, the Roman army reached Dastogerd, home of the favourite palace of the Persian Shah Khusro II, capturing an enormous quantity of booty that included textiles and fabrics, sugar, spices, and silver, and recovering 300 military standards that had been taken in battles in the past. Before returning to the imperial capital, Heraclius went to Jerusalem to stage a victory procession and the solemn restoration of the true cross that had been looted by Shah Khusro. It was a day of great celebration, accompanied by tears of joy which flowed from the awesome fervour of the emotion of onlookers, who were so overcome that they were not able to sing hymns of thanks. The confrontation between Rome and Persia had been couched on both sides in ominous terms as a fight between light and darkness. Extraordinary resources of time, manpower, and money had been poured into a war that had gone on for some 2 decades. The fighting not only had an impact on cities and markets in the Mediterranean, Levant, and Persia, but depressed the economies of networks and regions that were connected to them, such as in southern Arabia. A young merchant named Muhammad had gathered a small but loyal following around himself. His warnings of imminent doomsday struck a chord in the context of the more challenging economic conditions along trade routes in the Hijaz, the continuous fighting to the north, and apocalyptic propaganda in both Rome and Persia. Although there was substantial resistance to his radical message of the need for the purity, unity, and loyalty that would win God's favour. The decisive moment for the Prophet Muhammad and his companions came in 628, when, in a masterstroke of political accommodation, he reached agreement with the ruling elite in Mecca, in which he decreed that the direction of prayer should not be towards Jerusalem, but towards Mecca itself. This paved the way for reconciliation between different factions in Arabia, and laid the basis for a common identity that would provide an umbrella under which all the different peoples of the region could gather. The agreement proved to be a turning point not only for Mecca, the surrounding region, and Muhammad himself. It was one of the major turning points in world history. Muhammad, his movement, and followers emerged into a world that had been scarred by warfare and disease, by economic contraction, and by a collapsing global order. His own thinking had been apocalyptic too. The final judgment was nigh, warned Muhammad. The virtuous would go to paradise, the wicked to hell. As it happened, Muhammad and his followers emerged to be the prime beneficiaries, creating a vast new empire in the process. But it might not have turned out that way. Around 630, under the supreme leader Tong Yabgu, the Western Turk Empire had risen in prominence and power, but within 100 years experienced a rapid decline. The suddenness of the collapse was astounding, and the dramatic changes in fortunes have often been ascribed to internal divisions within the Turk world. Yet new research shows that a cocktail of crises, livestock mortality, food shortages, and harsh climate conditions stalled what might have been the creation of a vast empire. With a different set of climatological and ecological developments, it might have been the Altaic languages of the steppes and the devout Buddhism of Tong Yabgu that spread quickly in all directions. The bulk of those prizes now went instead to Muhammad and his followers, and to the Arabic language and to Islam. The decades that followed saw an explosive expansion of Arab armies across the Middle East through North Africa into southern Europe and deep into Central Asia. The result was a wide spread not only of Muslim beliefs and teachings, but of the Arabic language and ideas about music, poetry, and fashion, as well as art and architecture. Arab elites in the Iberian Peninsula harked back to homelands, building palaces and monuments. One poet spoke to the single palm tree in his garden, lamenting that both were a stranger in the West, far from our Orient home. Recognition that ecosystems and people alike did not find it easy to adapt to new locations. Environmental and ecological changes were underpinned by the creation of an enormous new world that bonded together the core territories of the Persian Empire, stretching from Asia Minor in the west as far as the Himalayas in the east, along with some of the richest and most important parts of the Roman Empire, including the breadbasket of Egypt and the harbours of the Levant. This was partly the result of the diffusion of crops and cultivars in knitting together a world that was not only culturally joined together, but also linked through foods, flavours, and recipes. The new Arab Empire provided two new things that had been in short supply in preceding decades: peace and manpower. A boom time followed, with cities expanding, swelled by rural workers migrating from the countryside, sparking change in other regions as new connections and opportunities emerged. From the 8th and 9th centuries, the Arab conquests opened up new geographic, ecological, and cultural frontiers. Drawing heavily on Greek scholars like Hippocrates and Aristotle, who wrote about how the environment affected personal character, Arab writers considered the peoples that they now came into contact with. Slavs and Franks in Western Europe, wrote al-Masudi, have grotesque natures, difficult characters, limited intelligence, and heavy tongues. This was because they lived in damp and cold regions which saw near endless rain and snow. The lack of warmth made clear why their religious beliefs could be considered limp and wishy-washy. The conquest of North Africa opened up new links beyond the Sahara Desert. A key reason for this was the development of the trans-Saharan gold trade and access to the rich deposits located at the headwaters of the Niger and Senegal rivers. Locations which were home to gold mines were strictly patrolled and access was forbidden. Once extracted, gold was made into bricks and sold in towns like Sijil Massa on the northern edge of the Sahara, a city so rich as a result of its role as emporium that it was home to 4 enormous mosques and a main street so long that it took half a day to walk from one end to the other. In the world of the Caliphate, pressures came primarily from within. Competition between rival factions at the court could sometimes spill into dynastic upheaval and secession. The Umayyad dynasty was overthrown in the middle of the 8th century by the Abbasids after almost 100 years in power. Revolutions like these could spark reform, primarily through a purge of the elite. As new leaders sought to win hearts and minds, they would often spend lavishly on public works and on patronage. Rather than a single Islamic golden age, there was a series of golden ages or golden waves, overseen by rulers with different resources at their disposal. Considerable effort went into gathering and translating Sanskrit texts about science into Arabic, and to bringing physicians from India to instruct about medicine. The explosion of literacy from the mid-8th century, which is sometimes linked to the introduction of paper to the Middle East from China, was a sign of rising prosperity. Wealth and leisure time helped generate interest in book production, as well as funding for scribes and for scholars to research, think, and write. Some writers were voracious readers, like Al-Jahiz, who reportedly rented bookshops so he could read volumes all night. According to one source, he was killed by a stack of volumes that collapsed on him when he was elderly and frail. The abundance of wealth that enabled this rich cultural world was equated with divine benediction. Both were closely linked with benign climate, and above all, the availability of food. After all, this had been one of the messages given by God to Muhammad in a cave near Mecca. Paradise would be a place where all one's needs would be catered for, from fruits to whatever else one desired. This was familiar in other Abrahamic faiths, Judaism and Christianity, where God has a central role as provider. God had provided manna from heaven, a special, fine flake-like thing that had to be collected before it was melted by the sun's rays, and was either eaten raw with a taste like honey, or baked into cakes that would not stink or get maggots. Perhaps the most famous example of divine intervention to provide food comes with the feeding of the 5,000, the only miracle that appears in all 4 Gospels of the Bible. In Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, God was not only the creator of the natural world, he was also the ultimate provider of resources. Just as the Bible underscores the idea that God perfected all creation, the Quran speaks of the order, beauty, and harmony of nature as being divinely ordained. As some contemporary scholars contend, the earliest teachings of Islam argue that biodiversity and rich ecosystems stem from God's creation and therefore deserve respect and maintenance. Naturally, plenty was not just the result of a benign God, but also the sign of a good ruler. The Caliph al-Mutawakkil was praised by one poet who wrote in rapture, "Thanks to you, vast tracts of land have become fertile. For sure, the world cannot be barren as long as you are its protector. In this bustling, vibrant world of widening horizons, rising populations and growing wealth, high cuisine was an important way of expressing cultural identities, especially for the urban bourgeoisie that in time extended beyond just the rich and powerful. Although some wryly noted that Baghdad was a joyful land for the affluent, but for the destitute an abode of anguish and sorrow, nevertheless there was great demand for the best ingredients, as well as information about where to find and how to prepare them. Do not be fooled into thinking that the wealthy have different food to normal people, warned the author of one Baghdadi cookbook. Personal tastes could sometimes be quixotic, such as those of the Caliph al-Watik, who had a penchant for aubergines and once ate 40 in a single sitting. Some gourmands were dismissive about vegetarianism, claiming that dishes made only of vegetables were a fraud, often being presented to look like meat but tasting nothing like it. In protest, one poet wrote, "Trifling vegetable dishes are not for me. Where is my kebab? Where are the fried dishes, the succulent roasts and the spiced meat? Bring them on!"
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
The Earth Transformed by Peter Frankopan and read by Hugh Bonneville. Episode 4. The Age of Turbulence. During the 19th century, the ecological implications of rapid transformations of landscapes, motivated by the chase for a fast buck, were severe and shocking. For example, the demand for rubber shot up as a result of Charles Goodyear's pioneering work in the 1830s on the vulcanization of rubber, the chemical process that improves elasticity, hardness and resilience, and then again by the development of the pneumatic tyre, perfected by John Dunlop in 1888. By the First World War, rubber was the most important, most sought-after new commodity in the world, much in demand for bicycles, cars, as well as a seemingly limitless new range of goods and products from shoes to electrical insulation. This versatility spurred a rush to alter the use of land. Vast amounts of rainforest in Southeast Asia were cut down and replanted with hevea seeds from the Amazon. The rate of transformation was not so much bewildering as epic. By the 1930s, millions of hectares of the world's richest rainforests had been replaced by rubber trees, by entrepreneurs who recognized that cheap land could be the basis of great fortunes. Central to this outlook was a philosophical framework which asserted that uncharted parts of the world were not only wild and lived in by savages, but home to endless sources of wealth. As David Livingstone put it, European expansion brought three elements that would be welcomed by all: Christianity, commerce, and civilization. The dovetailing of evangelical ideas about racial superiority, religious virtue, and capitalism was a core element of the way that Europeans, and the British above all, saw both themselves and the rest of the world. The global hunt for new commodities extended to other resources that were in abundant supply in South America, most notably guano, the excrement of wild birds and bats, whose value as a fertilizer had been well known for many centuries before the European arrival in the Americas. Inca kings had made it illegal to interfere with the enormous flocks of birds that congregated during breeding season on pain of death. So prized was the guano, which was spread over fields each year to help crops grow. Guano's value as a fertilizer rose dramatically during the age of scientific advancement, as concern about increasing food production to feed growing populations directed attention to improving crop yields. In the 1820s, it was the coast of what became the independent state of Peru that proved the greatest source of guano, as well as the most lucrative. Guano's properties were so prodigious that it took on a role in popular culture. One story, printed in a San Francisco newspaper in the 1850s, claimed that when the hatches were left open on a ship transporting guano, it caused the timbers of the vessel to sprout, the masts to grow, and a cherry table to grow fruit. Thanks to the craze for rubber and guano, the deepening trade connections with South America had far-reaching effects. In 1842, an unusual potato blight appeared in potato crops in New York and in many parts of Europe. Recent sequencing of DNA from strains of the blight suggests that it likely had an Andean origin and had been transmitted around the world among potato varieties exported from Peru that owed much to the country's place in global commercial networks. Ireland was severely affected by the blight. As many as 1 million died from hunger and disease in appalling conditions. For many, the choice was simple: migrate or die. Well over 1 million emigrated from Ireland. The exodus that followed the Irish famine was part of a much wider set of migrations, closely connected to the exploitation of foods, minerals, and natural resources. Clearing forests, reworking land, and establishing new plantations meant bringing in workers from locations near and far. So while the 19th century can be seen in terms of the reshaping of the natural environment, it also relied on massive changes in the human environment too. Just as crops were transplanted around the world, so too were people. Populations across Polynesia were devastated by raids that aimed to enslave and transport adult men against their will and force them to participate in collecting guano in Peru and preparing it for export. The abolition of slavery in Britain, Europe, and North America was symbolically and commercially significant, but it brought little by way of changes in attitude or behavior. Colonial administrators found it easy to convince themselves of their own virtues. Yet physical abuse was routine. In India, labourers who complained or did not meet their targets were beaten and in some cases even killed. So great were the losses in Congo to maltreatment, torture, starvation and disease during a boom lasting 40 years from the 1880s that every 10 kilos of rubber exported came at the price of 1 human life. The expansion of British political power in India sparked an ambitious set of new ideas to transform inefficient networks of canals, small dams and terraced fields fed by water channels. A dam built in 1852 that regulated the flow of the Godavari River was described as the noblest feat of engineering skills which has yet been accomplished in British India. A huge programme of track-laying turned India into the largest railway network in Asia and the 4th largest in the world. Above all, the colonies were where resources could be claimed and used by the colonizers. Commodities like palm oil, rubber, cotton, timber, coffee, cocoa, and metals were all needed for no end of manufactured goods. Colonizers saw the world as a rich paradise. Nature could be tamed just as local populations could be civilized. Scientific knowledge could be applied to impose and maintain control. All this powered a conviction that the world offered unlimited riches that could be developed and tapped forever. After a tour of East Africa in 1907, Winston Churchill did not mention the people of the region, commenting instead on its fertility and natural beauty. Africa, he went on, must one day become the great centre of tropical production, play a most important part in the economic development of the whole world. Africa, in other words, would be remodelled to suit the needs of people beyond, not those of its own people. British rule was steadfastly progressive, the Times claimed a month after the end of the First World War, the most beneficent in design and execution known in the history of mankind. Sir Michael O'Dwyer, who gained notoriety as the Lieutenant Governor of Punjab after the Jallianwala Bagh massacre of 1919, when British troops opened fire on peaceful protesters complaining about the arrest of pro-independence leaders, was even more emphatic. "The British Empire in India is the greatest achievement of our race," he wrote. "It has been built up by the blood, the brains, and the energy of our ancestors." In any event, he insisted, India never had unity, security, peace, justice, communications, public health, until the British came. Such self-congratulation hid the mechanics of how control was ruthlessly exerted to keep local populations in place and apart. The overwhelming dominance of colonizers offered almost unlimited and irresistible temptations. The Belgian King Leopold I simply asserted that the Congo River basin was his own, sparking a set of diplomatic crises not in West Africa, but in Europe, where some objected that they had been deprived by Leopold's action from undertaking their own exploitation. The seemingly unstoppable rise of the West caused some among the colonized communities to call for action. "Asia has sat too long in darkness and in the shadow of death," railed a group of radical Indian revolutionaries in exile in 1909, calling for an Asian parliament to be established, made up of educated Indians, Osmanlis, Egyptians, Japanese, Chinese, Arabs, Armenians, Parsis, Persians, Siamese, and others, to help rise up against the domination of European imperial powers. Anti-colonial attitudes hardened, often reinforced by strong ecological agendas that pointed out how lands were being stripped, overworked, and degraded for the benefit of people living thousands of kilometers away. "India's salvation," wrote Mahatma Gandhi in 1909, "consists of unlearning what she has learnt during the past 50 years. Modernity had brought unhappiness and oppression." He went on, "Machinery is the main symbol of modern civilization. It represents a great sin." Urbanization was sure to lead, he predicted later, to a slow but sure death for India's villages and villagers. True happiness could only come from living the simple peasant life and rejecting the technology, the consumption, and the ravages of colonialism. "The British Empire today," he wrote bitterly soon after the end of the First World War, "represents Satanism, repression, and terrorism. It will stoop to any atrocity to boost itself," he added. "It was the height of tyranny." Others, too, were struck by the pace and deleterious effects of modern life. Vsevolod Timonov was one Russian scholar who was sharply critical of the way nature's harmony was being ruined in the search for immediate profits. Human activities and lifestyles meant that factories spew their foul-smelling gases into the atmosphere, greatly impairing the enjoyment of nature. The result, he concluded, was that the climate is being ruined. Leo Tolstoy renounced alcohol, became a vegetarian, and gave up handling money as part of a search for a simple, self-sufficient and notionally traditional lifestyle, which in turn inspired Gandhi to create a utopian community in South Africa based on the same principles and ideals. Tolstoy had been so influential that Gandhi wrote to tell him of his development, to thank him for his guidance, and to reveal that the ashram had been christened Tolstoy Farm in his honour. The hypothesis that humanity was dangerous to itself and the natural world gained currency in the 19th century, with Ralph Waldo Emerson urging limits to how the wilderness was treated, and George Perkins Marsh warning that man wages an almost indiscriminate warfare upon all the forms of animal and vegetable existence around him. Human intervention was both damaging and relentless. As man advances in civilization, he gradually eradicates or transforms every spontaneous product of the soil he occupies. The logical culmination of such thinking came in a famous essay written in the 1960s, in which Lynn White argued that Judeo-Christian society had introduced a worldview that had made people less likely to care for the environment because it promoted humans as superior to and separate from nature, with the result that they became the primary causes of ecological crisis.
BBC Sounds. Music, radio, podcasts.
The Earth Transformed by Peter Frankopan and read by Hugh Bonneville. Episode 5. The Sharpening of Anxieties. The American anthropologist Margaret Mead noted in the late 1960s a generation was growing up fearful of global destruction, of cataclysmic nuclear war, and of an impending apocalypse that was all but inevitable. Young people, wrote Mead, have never known a time when war did not threaten annihilation. While the slogan, "Make love, not war," is often used to illustrate the anti-war movement roused by US involvement in Vietnam, the emerging ideas of the counterculture were closely linked to ecological concerns. Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, published in 1962, provided a rallying cry for those with deep concerns about ecological damage. She mourned the time when all life seemed to live in harmony with its surroundings, characterized by fields of grain and hillsides of orchards where deer silently crossed the fields, half hidden in the mists of fall mornings, all of which had been replaced by commercial farming that relied on industrial use of pesticides. It was as though some evil spell had settled on the community, marked by stillness, a spring without voices. Chemicals had killed all the birds. In the dedication, Carson thanked the polymath Albert Schweitzer and quoted his gloomy prediction that man has lost the capacity to foresee and to forestall. He will end by destroying the earth. Silent Spring was a runaway bestseller. It also helped influence debate in contemporary politics, even prodding President Kennedy into commissioning a report on the use of pesticides. Anxieties about ecological devastation were compounded by coverage of the Vietnam War. That conflict had seen the deliberate use by the US military of herbicides and defoliants against woodlands, crops, and rice fields to degrade the landscape, to deprive the Viet Cong forces of food, and so to weaken their capabilities and demoralize them. Between 1962 and 1971, Operation Ranch Hand sprayed around 90 million litres of herbicides over South Vietnam, including Agents Pink, White and Blue, but most famously Agent Orange, the most extensively used. In 1966, a petition signed by 5,000 scientists, including 17 Nobel Prize winners, was addressed to President Johnson, demanding that he end the use of herbicides in Southeast Asia. What the US was doing, said Yale professor and plant biologist Arthur Galston, amounted to ecocide. Then there were damaging accidents. In January 1969, a blowout in a well being drilled by Union Oil off the coast of Santa Barbara in California led to oil being released into the ocean at a rate of around 40,000 litres per hour for 11 days, an event described a year later by one journalist as an ecological shot heard around the world. Another shot came from a blaze on the River Cuyahoga in Cleveland, where oil and other pollutants caught fire in June 1969. These disasters fueled calls for action. President Nixon was clear that America needed to use the resources of the sea and of the land with more concern for preserving the natural world for the society we want for the future. Nixon was reading the tea leaves of a shift in public opinion, which was so profound that the New York Times speculated that, rising concern about the environmental crisis was sweeping the nation's campuses with an intensity that may be on its way to eclipsing student discontent over the war in Vietnam. Students were organizing lobby groups and even filing complaints against university authorities for their role in ecological damage and pollution. Urged to create a huge grassroots protest by Senator Gaylord Nelson, students, scientists, and conservationists worked together to publicize Earth Day. On the 22nd of April 1970, around 20 million Americans demonstrated about the environmental crisis and propelled these concerns to the top of political agendas around the world. Nixon swung into action, signing the National Environmental Policy Act, revising the Clean Air Act, and issuing an executive order to create the Environmental Protection Agency, all before the end of 1970. In the build-up to the first UN Conference on the Environment, held in Stockholm in June 1972, an unofficial report commissioned by Kurt Waldheim, the UN Secretary-General, stressed the fragility of the planet's energy system. What was needed was a new capacity for global decision-making and global care. Man must accept responsibility for the stewardship of the world. "We share your concern at the rapid deterioration of flora and fauna," said Indira Gandhi, the Prime Minister of India, in her address to the conference. "However, it should not be forgotten that another species is also imperilled: man. In poverty, said Gandhi, he is threatened by malnutrition and disease, in weakness by war, in richness by the pollution brought by his own prosperity. Advanced countries had become rich through dominating others and exploiting their resources. Are not poverty and need the greatest polluters? She said. A treasure trove of thousands of documents relating to U.S. military activities in Southeast Asia in the late 1960s had been handed over to the press. Known as the Pentagon Papers, these began to appear in print in a series of scoops and revelations in the New York Times and Washington Post that had readers riveted. One of the most striking revelations was about long-term efforts to manipulate the weather in Southeast Asia during the Vietnam War. A report had alleged that Air Force rainmakers had succeeded in turning the weather against the North Vietnamese in a hush-hush project codenamed Intermediary Compatriot that had begun in 1967 and had increased rainfall over jungle road networks. A detailed account appeared in the summer of 1972 in a lengthy exposé by the journalist Seymour Hersh. As one official with detailed knowledge of the operation explained, "We were trying to arrange the weather pattern to suit our convenience." This was a reference to the project Popeye, whose objective was to produce sufficient rainfall along communication lines in North Vietnam and southern Laos by seeding clouds with iodine to interfere with truck traffic and to interrupt supplies. During this test phase, more than 50 cloud seeding experiments were conducted. The results were described by the Department of Defense as outstandingly successful. One U.S. Special Forces camp in Vietnam was inundated with 9 inches of rain in 4 hours. In Senate hearings in 1972, it emerged that the U.S. had been involved in weather interventions in other countries. "This was extremely distressing," protested Claiborne Pell, chair of the hearings in the Senate in April 1972. "If we do not restrict military use of current environmental modification techniques," he said, "we risk the danger of the development of vastly more dangerous techniques whose consequences may be unknown and may cause irreparable damage to our global environment." The committee recommended that the U.S. government seek the agreement of other governments in pursuit of an international treaty banning the use of any environmental or geophysical modification as a weapon of war. That overture was of particular significance for the Soviet Union and for Washington's relations with Moscow. In the late 1960s, the USSR had undertaken a huge program to build up its nuclear arsenal. This eventually led to the Strategic Arms Limitation Talks, SALT, which began in 1969 and concluded in the signing of an initial agreement in Moscow 3 years later. Of central importance was modelling the possible impact of nuclear war between the US and the Soviet Union, so that such knowledge might act as a deterrent to the use of these powerful weapons. The doomsday scenario of nuclear winter caught the public imagination as an end-of-the-world story that fit the times. It sat alongside disasters in the 1980s such as drought and famine in Ethiopia, the global AIDS epidemic, the catastrophe at the Chernobyl nuclear facility, and more, which framed humans as their own worst enemy. On top of these fears came yet another worrying concern about climatic change. Scientists working on the ozone layer had been concerned about its depletion since the 1970s, suggesting that the damage was being done by the release of CFCs, often used in aerosols and as solvents. International efforts to phase out CFCs led to the Vienna and then the Montreal Protocols being signed in March 1985 and September 1987 respectively, with Kofi Annan, later UN Secretary-General, referring to the latter as perhaps the single most successful international agreement overseen by the United Nations. The 1980s in many ways were a golden age, a time of genuine resolve to try to counter major problems through working together. The agreement about ozone in 1987 was one example, but other major initiatives were also adopted, such as the Convention on Biological Diversity, after the United Nations agreed in 1988 to hold a major conference on environment and development. The UN General Assembly recognized that decisive, urgent and global action is vital to protecting the ecological balance of the Earth. In the summer of 1989, a chain reaction began that eventually led to the fall of the Berlin Wall, to the reunification of Germany, to the replacement of communist regimes across Europe by democratically elected governments, and ultimately to the USSR ceasing to exist in December 1991. In retrospect, this was a golden opportunity for bridge building and rapprochement. In the event, history took a different course. The collapse of the USSR gave rise to two seismic shifts. The first was that the vast natural resources that had been under the economic and political control of Moscow for decades suddenly became available for intensive exploitation on global markets. The second was that the shock of what had happened in 1989 in Eastern Europe and the USSR had a profound effect on thinking in Beijing, which had almost succumbed to similar demands for reforms and freedoms when mass protests led by students reached Tiananmen Square in the heart of the Chinese capital that summer. The outcome was a fundamental reorientation in Chinese domestic, foreign and economic policies. It is hard to overstate the importance of these two developments. The decades that followed 1989 have proved to be by far the most intensive period of commercial exchange and integration, or globalization, in history, in terms of scale and intensity, as well as of speed. The impacts on local, regional and global climate have been epic and unprecedented in human and natural history. The consequences will shape the world for generations to come.